Hello and welcome to this UK Council for Graduate Education webinar on effective practices in supervising doctoral candidates at a distance. My name's Owen Gower and I'm the Director of the UK Council for Graduate Education. I'll be facilitating this discussion. We've structured the discussion today into 3 presentations in which we'll look at the kinds of issues that are coming up for doctoral candidates during the pandemic, what kinds of communication tools are available to support doctoral supervision and what to bear in mind when using them, and what to prioritize in doctoral supervision at this time. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom or the comments section in YouTube to ask questions during the presentations. There'll be some time after each presentation for specific questions. Otherwise, I'll save general questions for the panel discussion at the end. Before we begin, just a reminder that the Council has a specific webpage listing all of our resources to support the postgraduate sector during the pandemic. You can find that at ukcge.ac.uk. That list includes recordings of webinars on adapting postgraduate education for online delivery, our guidance on conducting online vivas, and our list of forthcoming meetings. We're adding to our resources all the time, and in particular, we're very grateful to Professor Stan Taylor, who's editing some guidance for us specifically on doctoral supervision at distance. That will be available shortly. So you can sign up for our newsletter if you want to be kept informed of all that. Right now, without further ado, here are our panelists, and I'd like them to introduce themselves now, please.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Douglas Halliday. I'm from Durham University, based in the Physics Department, and I am the Director of the university's Global Challenge Centre for Doctoral Training.
James. James, I wonder if we can hear from you.
Sorry about that, trouble with the muting. My name is James Bruce. I'm a senior lecturer in chemistry at the Open University, and until recently I was director of the OU Graduate School.
Thank you. Sam?
I'm Samantha Oakley, and I work in the researcher development team at the University of Glasgow. And one of the activities I'm engaged in there is creating workshops and resources to support our supervisors.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Douglas, you're the first presenter, so over to you.
Okay, Owen, thank you very much. So if we can move on to the next slide. This just gives a brief summary of the context of the comments I'll be making today. So we have at Durham a Global Challenge Doctoral Training Centre. It consists of a single cohort of 24 international students from 17 different countries, some of whom are currently overseas because of travel restrictions, and some of whom are currently based in Durham under lockdown, as we all are. So we've done a number of actions, which I'll talk about shortly. I've also conducted a series of one-to-one interviews with 21 out of the 24 students. And I'm also speaking partly from my own personal experience of supervising students in my own research group at this time. So that gives you a sense of the sample group that I'm talking about in terms of relating to my own experiences of supervision. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to begin with just a synopsis of what our candidates are thinking. And you can see that I've grouped it into 2 issues, practical issues, which of course are very important, but also what I'm calling emotional issues. And I think it is the case that we might need to think and focus a little more on these emotional issues at this time. So first, the practical issues. Those are things that would apply to anyone reasonably familiar with students working in a variety of contexts, particularly in developing countries. So things like power cuts, unreliable Wi-Fi, which has implications in terms of scheduled or unscheduled contact. International students do also worry a little bit about sort of legislative issues such as visas, insurance and travel. So I think it's important to keep them updated on those. Everyone that I've spoken to has what I'm calling a sort of loosely defined concern about lack of progress. And that stems from the sort of general precarity that they are all experiencing at this time. Some of them are struggling in terms of contact with supervisors using new tools. And also about unknown expectations. So I think a key point is being clear about what one's expectations as supervisor are. You know, students are beginning to think about possible approaches to mitigation, some of which might include reformulating their PhD projects in terms of developing new methods, methodologies, and so on. So going from plan A to plan B. And for some students, they will really struggle with that, I think. So the emotional issues, I think, are not limited to postgraduate students. I think as academic staff, you know, we can relate to many of these, being confined, having a sense of uncertainty about, you know, being able to do all the tasks that we expect to do, managing expectations under lockdown where you're sharing working space with family and others. Some international students are finding it difficult to deal with Ramadan in the UK at this time, particularly given the lengthy daylight hours in the UK compared with their home nation, for example. And, you know, just a general sense of feeling down, feeling separated, feeling isolated. So on the next slide, you'll see there that I've offered some reflections on those just to try and bring the issues together. So I've started by sort of what I call general precarity in all areas. And I think at this time, it's important that supervisors can adopt a sort of more pastoral approach to engage with students and really get a sense of what those issues are. I think it's also important to set realistic expectations of them in terms of progress, what you would expect from them. And I think it's also important to share with them that, you know, you are on this journey with them, that they're not on their own, that although they may feel struggling, they may feel slightly powerless, that as a supervisor, you are there to help and encourage them. Some of them clearly won't have the experience and the skills to modify their research project. So I think at the appropriate time, it's helpful to have conversations with them in terms of how you might take that forward and support them when you think that's appropriate in terms of new methodology, data sets, whether they might work and complete their project with existing data rather than planned data, and so on. You know, the kind of conversations that you might expect to have with your PhD students. You'll see here I've stressed the importance of support, and I think my experience is that you cannot underestimate the amount of support and supportive messages that students really appreciate and benefit from. Even if you don't quite know or haven't quite formulated the support in your own mind, I think it's still really important to give encouraging and positive message, which relates to them. You know, I think it's important as a supervisor, you take time to engage with them and find out about their particular situation, where they're living, who they're sharing their accommodation with, those kinds of things. I think that demonstrates a wider concern of their issues. Maintaining a sense of community, I think, is really important, and that links to having sort of regular contact. You know, it might be better to have a shorter number of online sessions, but more frequently to engage with your students. You know, supervision, getting the approach right is really important at this time. You know, it's not business as usual. And I think, you know, a key message from me is that we need to acknowledge in our communication and interaction with students that we understand this is not business as usual. This is a temporary arrangement, and that we're offering support as best we can. And I think the other final comment on this screen is that personal messages, I think, really help rather than just a group broadcast message to everybody. I think it's more powerful when a student receives an individual message. It sort of resonates more with them. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the responses, things that we have done in the context of the current lockdown. We did an online cohort survey. 80% of our students answered. And these you can see here on the screen are the sort of issues that they identified, concerns about sharing workspace with family. Many of our students who are overseas have concerns about unreliability of Wi-Fi. That may or may not apply to you in the UK. What was interesting is that just under half said they didn't have a sort of fixed daily routine, and a similar number said that they didn't turn their computer off. So I think that's really important to encourage them to think about well-being and structure and the role that organisation and structure can play in terms of maintaining well-being. 80% felt confident about sharing concerns with someone, not necessarily the supervisor, but someone that they feel close to and confident in terms of sharing with. So you can see there that, the one-to-one meetings, it took about 8 hours to get through, but, I felt that it was a very positive thing to do. We also asked our supervisors to complete a risk analysis in terms of thinking about the particular context of this group of students where many were overseas, what the risks were, whether it was safer for them to remain where they were or to travel back to the UK. And we've also sent out regular newsletters to the supervisors and to the students and indeed to the wider university, explaining the various mitigation steps that we've taken. So I think at this time, it's fair to say that support is a really important dimension of what we have to provide as supervisors. And you can see there my sort of reflections 6 weeks into lockdown. I think strong messages are important. Communicating concern, realism, engaging with the individual. I think regular contact is important. So it's worth reflecting on the frequency and the length of contact to maintain engagement with the student. Community identity is very important. I mean, this is a doctoral training centre, so there is a cohort dimension. So that is something that we've worked really hard to maintain. So we have activities on MS Teams. We have a weekly challenge where we get students to send photographs or bake something or, something like that. So that I think also helps. And in terms of supervision, I think sometimes we need to go beyond what we've done before. We need to think about what I've said here about supervising the whole person. I've had a number of online sessions where children have appeared on the screen, so you engage briefly with the children and ask how they are and, show an interest. So that kind of thing. And I think that really helps to communicate to the doctoral candidates that you're aware of the circumstances that they find themselves in. So I think it's about being courageous in terms of trying new approaches, in terms of extending the support you offer at this time. And the final point on this slide, I think it's also about beginning to think about the preparation for what might happen in the future in terms of coming out of isolation, as it says there. So the final slide from me is just a sort of synopsis of some of the opportunities that we have provided for our students using the online environment. We've got some activities on MS Teams that you can read there. We have a regular weekly slot at a defined time, midday, 12:30, because we've got students across 11 different time zones. So you can see there the kinds of things that we've tried. We're going to do a virtual writing retreat. We're going to do some academic writing workshops. We're going to do leadership development workshops. In many ways, we're trying to maintain the kinds of training and support that we might have offered, but adapting it and modifying it for the online environment. So then finally, for me, the key issues, it's about, I think being, I said they're a decent human. I'm not implying that any of us are not decent, but I think, sometimes we might have to let that aspect maybe come through a little more in our engagement and supervision, communication, regular offers of help, get all supervisors on board. And I'm concluding with a comment from one of the candidates that we interviewed. And, for me, this was a sort of textbook example of, how good supervision can work. the candidate said, do not be scared of your supervisor. They are a tool that you can use to adjust your expectations. And I think if we approach supervision in that open spirit, then I'm hopeful that we will engage and will offer benefit to our students at this time. So I think I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Douglas, we've had a few questions coming in. I think some may be more general, but a couple I wouldn't mind just putting you on the spot for, if you don't mind.
Of course.
One is about whether or not you've given any thought to future planning in relation to your cohort.
Yes, we have. So, I mean, that came up in the one-to-one meetings, and we asked the students what they thought the impact would be, and that extends from one candidate who said they were reasonably confident they could finish their PhD project on schedule, to at the other end of the spectrum, another candidate who said because their fieldwork relies on rainy seasons, which have an annual cycle, they may well need a one-year extension. So, our planning and thinking is that students will require additional time somewhere within the sort of 3, 6, maybe exceptionally 12-month addition. And so at the moment, our university is in the position of considering at the institutional level how they might finance and resource funded extensions. I think if we offer extensions, they have to be funded. We're also exploring the extent to which research projects might modify, methodologies might change, the extent or the depth of data sets might change in terms of enabling students to achieve their original objectives, perhaps with less data than they had originally envisaged. And then finally, to say for one student, COVID presents an interesting opportunity because they are doing a PhD on neglected tropical diseases. So there are some interesting parallels there that COVID might indeed expand the scope of the research project.
And Douglas, it was just one other question directly for you, which is in relation to the new initiatives that you've laid out for us and the new roles for supervisors in supporting their doctoral candidates. What have you got any thoughts or insights in how we support the supervisors' mental health and well-being with the additional burden of the support that you think they should be offering to their candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. We kind of talk and assume as, we are invincible and everyone else, is getting our help and our support. And I think, that's really important. I mean, at our university, we've set up various groups on MS Teams that allow interaction amongst staff. At the moment, there isn't a channel specifically for PhD supervision, but I'm now thinking we might do that. But I think it's really just a case of maintaining our own peer support networks. I think that's the most effective way, so we have an opportunity to discuss. And also, it may be that our Centre for Academic Development or Professional Development or HR, wherever it sits within your institution, would be another place to go in terms of guidance and support at this time.
Thank you, Douglas. Moving on now to James, over to you.
Thank you. So at the Open University, roughly half our students are at a distance from the main campus, be it because they're part-time or the nature of their research, or they're at our affiliated research centres around the world. So in some respects, you might think that it's business as usual for us at the OU because we're used to this. But one point I want to make early is that we're not. It's caught us just as much by surprise as everyone else. And it's definitely, as Douglas said, not business as usual. And something I've been trying to help frame my thinking around it is business as useful in terms of doing what can and needs to be done, and not just doing things because we're trying to find our way to a sort of a perfect situation. Now, in my own supervision, I started using various mobile apps for communication and data sharing quite a lot, in part because in my role as a graduate school director, I used to operate an open door policy with my students. I had the informal way of contacting them as well as the formal. But when I was a graduate school director, I found it was much harder for my students to have the informal access. And I found that was quite important in my experience in building up that sort of relationship with the doctoral candidates under my supervision. So we started trying out some apps here, and on this slide, I wanted to share some of the ones that I'd looked at. And unfortunately, they have just appeared now. That's good. So there are three apps that I've looked at in detail, and you could say they ranked in order of preference. So Wire, WhatsApp, and Slack are all apps that both have they operate through a web application or through a mobile phone application, and they're a means of sharing text, audio, and video, and they have group and individual channels. These things to me are absolutely crucial in making things work. So it's not just a means of sending messages. If you can send audio and video as well, that makes it quite powerful. So my students, for example, would film something happening in the lab and then send it to me without an audio commentary, so I could see it wherever I was and send a response back and comment on it. They have to be easy to use, and the most important thing to my mind is they have to be secure. They're not public facing. I first tested this trying with Twitter using direct messaging, but that's not really what Twitter was about, and that's why we moved rapidly away from it. And so we've settled on Wire because, in my experience, I don't know the details of the encryption, but it seems to be the most secure way of transmitting and sharing data and information backwards and forwards. And so we have a group channel and an individual channel. So people, if it's in the group channel, everyone can see it. If it's an individual, it's a one-to-one sort of space. And so and a key advantage of these sorts of things over, I think, some of the video conferencing that people are using is that this can be, you can mix synchronous and asynchronous. So you don't necessarily get bombarded with lots of communication coming out to you at once. You can still say, right, I'm going to look at my Wire messages or contact from my students at this time in the day. So you've got a little bit of control over it, but you can schedule group calls as well, and bring people together. And that I found even pre-pandemic was quite a useful way of keeping the group together, particularly when some of my students went for long periods out of the country working with other collaborators and that sort of thing. They're still my student and my supervisory responsibility. And rather than just saying, we'll see you in a year's time and just keep in touch by email, I actually found it was a nice informal way to maintain contact with them. And so on the next slide, what I want to sort of talk about a little bit more is how you might use these things. So particularly in a time now where we're all sort of stuck working at home, they can be used in research group meetings alongside if you're doing it by Zoom or Skype for Business, that sort of thing. We've been trying asynchronous journal clubs where we someone can post a paper up and then people can just comment on it. And as I said earlier, they are very good for impromptu sharing of data and results. And in some respects, I've been trying to work on more on this distinction between formal and informal contact. So we still have the obligation to do those formal supervisory meetings, which, if you like, form the supervisory record, and they tend to be conducted as much as possible in a Microsoft Teams or a Skype for Business space. But to help those, we try and do a little bit more informal sharing of what's going to happen at the meeting beforehand, so that we're so we can make the most out of the time available. And I don't know about you, but I certainly find that a lot of the formal video meetings are quite exhausting. So you do need to sort of think carefully about the time that you're going to use those for. Whereas the apps, as they get a little bit more informal, give you a way of stepping away from the sort of synchronous video call environment, but still maintaining contact. And that leads into how they have a role in a certain social space. So you can use them for running quizzes and that sort of thing. And so I know some of the students at the university are running groups via WhatsApp where they can do they can just discuss things and share things informally there. We've also got we're using Skype for Business at the moment, but we have a weekly coffee morning, again very informal. It's a mixture of staff and students, and it gives a chance for people to get together. We're still running our weekly seminar program online, so I gave a seminar to the students in my school last week about how industry and academia work in our STEM field in terms of funding and supporting and working together. So we're keeping a little bit of that normal as much as possible. But it does, of course, it's not the same as walking into a seminar room and giving a seminar. It's still a little bit, you need to give yourself a little bit more time and think about doing less in the same amount of time as you would do if it was face to face. it's also building in, we're fortunate the graduate school has quite a large online presence through its our graduate school network. And so that gives them access to the formal stuff in terms of the documentation and the training resources. But they've also been very active through their social media, doing daily tweets around themes, posing a question, what's your virtual victory in this week that's happened to you, those sort of things, or what's your favorite cocktail? And it's all just designed to sort of keep people in contact. And that's quite important, because what I will touch on now in my next and final slide, it's how you deal with the unexpected. Now, normally when we're preparing for a remote distance supervision, the process of application, recruitment and induction prepares us for how we will manage the unexpected that crops up in the normal course of a doctoral candidate's journey. And that does take time. And equally, when one of my students is about to go away for an extended period, one of our last face-to-face meetings will be how we're going to communicate, but also what we think the unexpected will be. So there's all that sort of planning. But it has to be said that COVID-19 is completely unexpected, and its impacts are unexpected because we still don't really know what the sort of final impact's going to be. And I think the one thing I would say is that the short notice that we've had to prepare for this sort of decamp off campus means these unexpected issues are more likely. And so the mitigation around those is perhaps much harder. I think what we've been sort of doing is using several channels to communicate. So it comes back to that blend between the formal and the informal, so that there's several ways of making sure that a particular person is all right. So if the students are communicating as a group and you're not hearing from one of them, it's finding out, getting a sense from how everybody is. But it's also having to be perhaps a little bit more on the front foot, which is quite hard if you're equally feeling the sort of the pressures of the situation, because supervision isn't the only thing we're doing. But if a student isn't responding to your normal contact and missing scheduled points of contact, reach out to them even in an informal way. Particularly if you've got a sense of what their interests are, if you know that they're managing perhaps carers, or their work, if they're part-time, if their work situation is perhaps having an impact. And it's about trying to create that space where everyone can share and be quite open. And in your own, and in some respects as a supervisor, I try and model that. So I've been more open with my students about how I'm feeling about the particular situation we find in, the difficulties I'm having, so that they can see then that they're not alone, particularly if they're isolated on their own. They're missing that ability to see how other people are coping. And so getting across the idea that we aren't in a perfect situation at the moment, we don't quite know when it's going to come out, and it's about really supporting with each other. And as that gets, and when you find that getting more and more overwhelming, it's about engaging with the support at your institution, whether it's through a graduate school or through your faculty or school that has, whether it's postgraduate tutors, people are responsible for the normal management and support of a doctoral research program. And again, asking for help early, so that if a student really is dropping out of contact, you can start keeping the records that you've tried to maintain contact, so that if necessary, you might have to move it into the formal procedures that the university already has. And in that way, you're not taking the whole responsibility on yourself. So it's a bit of a judgment call as to when you do that, but hopefully the regular sort of staff check-ins, people are asking about the postgraduate students and asking about the supervisors, as well as all the other things. And it's that kind of community of support that I think which will help. And I think I would close by saying that really the unexpected in this particular situation is very difficult to prepare for. So people shouldn't be beating themselves up if something does catch them by surprise. And it comes back to doing the best you can under the circumstances. And I will finish there. Thank you.
James, thank you ever so much. I've just got a couple of specific questions for you. One is on the apps that you mentioned, particularly Wire. Is that free to access?
It is. There's also a business application app version, but I've been able to download a version that's free to use.
Thank you. And then another specific question in relation to research group meetings and online meetings of that sort. Have you found that there's an ideal group size beyond which it just gets unmanageable?
Yes, I mean, well, my group's only about 6 strong and we work relatively well at that. The key thing, which is why I brought in some of the apps when we're on Zoom, or not Zoom, Skype for Business, I find students who are normally forthcoming face to face are less forthcoming now. So it's about, again, trying to break the ice a little bit.
Thank you very much. There are other questions coming in, but we'll come back to those in the general discussion after we've heard from Sam. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to talk briefly about a resource with this title that I created a few weeks ago. And when lockdown started, my thoughts turned to the materials that I had from a workshop that I ran for our supervisors at the University of Glasgow, and that was on distance supervision. And this was a workshop that we ran for our supervisors, and we had input from experienced supervisors and from students. But when I looked at the stuff that I had from that workshop, really the premise of that was mitigating the issues arising from the separation of students that are on campus and students that might be remote, and therefore having perhaps a less good experience. And to be quite honest, some of the suggestions that I made for dealing with that didn't really feel appropriate now. They just didn't fit our kind of current crazy world where, you know, all the students are at a distance and everyone is facing enormous challenges. So instead, I thought very, very carefully about what would I feel confident about telling our supervisors now about remote supervision. And I really felt that because I was sort of thinking about all supervisors, all subject areas, some with maybe one student, others with huge cohorts, I didn't really feel I could say too much about all the amazing creative things that you can do, because a lot of people really can't do that right now. So instead, what I came up with was, I guess, a kind of set of suggestions for anxious supervisors, which really focus on protecting the well-being and stress levels of the supervisor as much as the student. And really all it is something to aid personal reflection, if you like, about what needs to be covered. So I thought I'll just talk you through about what I came up with, and there's a link that we can share to the video and the resource as well. And I'll welcome your thoughts at the end. So really, my first 2 points are essentially a really important reality check. I feel you really have to be realistic about what you can do as a supervisor, and it's absolutely, you do not have to pretend that you're okay if you're not okay, and if you're dealing with kids and stress and all kinds of things going on. These are absolutely unprecedented times. So you don't need to tell your students about your personal life, of course you don't, but I think you do have to communicate to them that there are going to be limitations on what you can manage, and to ask for their understanding that you can't carry on as normal right now. So communicating with them about your own limitations, I think, is important. And also, you have to assume that your students can be facing all manner of difficulties. Now, we've already seen from Douglas's excellent work with his cohort, all the different kind of scenarios people are facing. But students don't have to talk to you about their private lives, and they might feel very proud about not admitting what's going on with it. But anyone who's got kids or who's working part-time in an essential occupation, maybe someone's been bereaved, people abroad or at home in really difficult living conditions, they can be finding this incredibly challenging. And I think it's not just that you need to assume that they might be dealing with struggles, but also I think it is really important to remind other students of this too. So if you're in charge of any kind of cohort, I think, you know, some students will be really fired up with ways to use the time productively, but it's really important to raise awareness that not everyone can be doing this. And in fact, that this crisis might be worsening existing inequalities within HE. And personally, I think we need to raise awareness of this with our PhD students, because they're the researchers of the future. So moving on to the next 2 points, I think it's really important just to make sure that your student is accessing the essential university communications. This may be stating the obvious. You don't need to mediate it for them. That's adding a lot of extra work on yourself. But I think it is important just to make sure that they are checking their email and the university website, to encourage them to be independent, to look up the answers for themselves. I think a lot of stuff is going up on websites, FAQs, that kind of thing. And don't give yourself more work by trying to mediate it all. But of course, what you do need to do, and again, our previous two speakers have been speaking a lot about this, is how you establish your communications right now with your student again. So hopefully at the start, you would have agreed some kind of communication plan. Obviously right now, you're going to need to look at that again, have a sort of talk about how you can both realistically meet, both in terms of frequency and what technology is going to work for you. And James had some excellent suggestions there that included synchronous and asynchronous options. I think it's really important not to assume that video Zoom meetings are always going to be the answer. I think some students really welcome the opportunity to see a face and to have that kind of rapport. Other people find these really, really difficult. And for some cases, Wi-Fi isn't good enough. So agreeing what technology is going to be comfortable for both of you is going to be really good. And I think getting the communications right will manage your students' expectations of what they expect from you, and also make them feel supported if there's a good plan in place, and obviously then communicating if you can't stick to that plan. So moving on to the next 2 points. These two are kind of, I feel, much more subject specific. Now the top one there, helping your student make best use of their time. I mean, this is really the key role for the supervisor. But bearing in mind all the constraints that they might be experiencing. I know that, say, some subject areas, there's big issues around getting ethical clearance if you're going to change how you're collecting your data, or it might be that they need to consider data management concerns if you're moving your data from something that was accessible on campus to off campus. I know that our team at the University of Glasgow, they've put up a blog post on the web about issues that you might be facing in terms of data management. But it might be if the students can't actually get on with much at all, it's better to focus on career development or training activities. And in terms of the supervisor helping them decide what to focus on, I think if you're really open to their suggestions, then you may find that they're revealing something to you in those conversations about their state of mind and the limitations that they're facing. So in terms of the second point here, I think this in some ways is the hardest one, but if you can, making sure student isn't intellectually sort of isolated. Do they have a peer group? Are they part of your wider team or your wider department? And for many subject areas, you might just have one student who's fairly isolated in terms of what they're studying. But are people in that subject area perhaps getting together online, perhaps on Twitter for any activities? So you may need to ask around, but it would really not only help the student if they can be part of some kind of other cohort, but it also means that you're not their sole support and their source of ideas. And there may be a networking advantage here that they can get some benefits out of this. So moving on to the last 2 points that I'd like to make here. It's the top one. It's really, really easy to forget to actually articulate this. But obviously we all want our students to do well. And I think it's an absolute nightmare at the moment. We're all dealing with all these uncertainties. We recently ran a session for our own supervisors. All the questions were about, funding. Should people ask for an extension? Should we admit new students to start in September? We just don't have the answers for a lot of these points. And I think when we do get the answers, I can guarantee we are just going to have more questions. So there is a terrible sort of panic about dealing with all this uncertainty. But one thing that I think we can be really confident about is that everyone at the university wants these students to succeed and will do everything they can to help them, not least because it's one of our key success metrics. And I think as well, in terms of reassuring the students, we can all hope that there will be new opportunities to replace things that they may not have been able to happen in the past, things that have been lost. And there might be better ways of doing things. It might be that students can attend online conferences that they could never have hoped to attend in real life. So hopefully there will be some real positives. And finally, the point at the bottom, I think James has touched on this as well. There's huge communities of support there to help you as supervisors at your university. So if you need to get an answer or advice on something, you absolutely do not have to figure it all out for yourself. These are the names that we give the support services at Glasgow, but you'll have your own departments, hopefully, who can help you answer things. So that is a really quick run through of what my kind of suggested priorities are. And I think if you think all of those are stating the absolutely obvious, I think that's really good. That's kind of my ideal scenario. But I think if you're managing to do all of those, then you're doing a fantastic job right now of being a supervisor in like really, really challenging conditions. And I'd really like it if you're willing to share in the chat with me or with everyone, if there's anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to say to an anxious supervisor at this point in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. I've just got a question I'd like to put straight to you, if that's all right, because I think it relates to your last point about not needing to know all the answers. But we've had a question about the supervisor being overwhelmed by trying to offer the candidate skills development, additional skills development that might normally have been offered by other parts of the university. Can you offer any advice on that?
I think certainly in terms of skills development, you absolutely want to be engaging with your research or development or whatever it's called at your university, because hopefully there will be some central provision that you can tap into. There's also so much stuff now coming online within each subject area. So it's, if you don't know what stuff is available, then absolutely ask colleagues in your same area who might have suggestions for what people should focus on.
Thank you. James, can I turn to you now with a question specifically about candidates researching through creative practices being supported? Did you want to make an analogy here with access to labs and so on?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I would hasten to point out I'm certainly not supervised in the creative arts space, but the impact on the pandemic on people being unable to access the spaces they need to support their research is quite a critical one, because even as we emerge out of a tighter lockdown, it's likely to be phased. So some of the sort of things like people who need to go off on field work might find that particularly difficult to do, and similarly people in the performing arts spaces again might find that those things are emerging from lockdown with much more restricted circumstances. And so depending on the length of time, it may be that it's a pause of registration, but if it's going on for longer, it really needs a discussion between the supervisor and the doctoral candidate to come up with an alternative plan.
Thank you. Douglas, can I turn to you now about a question that's been raised a couple of times on engagement from the candidate, where we've had one question that says, what do you do when you have lack of communication from the doctoral candidate when all you get is silence? And then another question on the chat here about how do you ensure engagement with the virtual environment that you're trying to create under the circumstances?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Owen. I mean, to deal with the first question, I mean, I think if you're not getting engagement with the candidate, I'm assuming that will be to things like email or WhatsApp or other forms of inquiry. I think that would, to me, suggest that, you know, the candidate is finding it very difficult to bring themselves to communicate with the supervisor. And I think what COVID does is it presents an opportunity for us to be slightly more emphatic in our approaches. So, for example, in that situation, I would suggest that you communicate with the student saying, you know, I'm really want to catch up with you to check how you are, to make sure everything's all right. I've arranged a sort of an online meeting at this date, at this time for 20 minutes, half an hour. Please, could you let me know if you're available, and reschedule it. So I think, you know, really in that situation, the only way you're going to find out how the candidate is if you're able to encourage a sort of an interaction. And of course, that first interaction should be relatively low key, I think, and just be about finding out what their challenges are, what their problems are, you know, why they're finding issues difficult. And also being mindful, I think, of the important point that Sam made, that in some cultures, some students may not be comfortable revealing that sort of information to the supervisor. So it's about navigating through that. And then really with the other question about engaging with a sort of cohort online type activity. Yeah, I mean, I think my experience is that we're finding that engagement with our online platform is probably larger engagement than if we were offering face-to-face workshops on campus. So I think, to me, that suggests that, students are really keen to continue to be part of an online environment. And the final thing I'll say is that, we should not underestimate the role and importance of peer support structures that we are not involved with. So, for example, I know that my group of international students have a very active private WhatsApp group and Facebook group that, I'm not involved with. So I know there's a lot of behind the scenes communication there. And, I think if you're aware of that, you might be able to find a way of feeding into that and using that to sort of really encourage the students to engage with what you're offering them.
Thank you. Sam, turning to you, we've had a specific question to ask you for advice on dealing with vulnerable doctoral candidates who may disclose something to a supervisor during supervision. What are the do's and the don'ts in that situation in terms of disclosing something that they need support with?
I think, again, it's vitally important at that point to check in with the people at your institution who you've got there to help you. So certainly don't feel you have to deal with it yourself as a supervisor, but I think you would have to tap into, so in our place, we've got, the wellbeing service or student support services, but definitely don't feel you have to try and deal with these things by yourself. At the moment, our university, we've got a huge amount of advice has gone up on our website about dealing with mental health and working remotely. So perhaps turning there first of all, but it depends how severe the problem actually was, I think.
Thank you. They've got lots of questions coming in about data collection and altering research methodologies in that regard. If I just pick on one for you, James, how can we find online alternatives to face-to-face data collection, especially with young people? The person's really wanting suggestions and advice about software packages and online approaches that guard privacy. Is there anything you can say about that?
Yes, again, I think without sounding like I'm on a commission from Wire, it's applications like that have very secure end-to-end encryption, and you can create time-limited groups. But I would, any piece of software like that, you would need to take it through your ethics committee's approval process so they can check and also verify the GDPR rules and how they stand. The only other alternative would be, and it depends on your IT capacity, would be a web-based application created and hosted by your university that allows that kind of exchange.
Thank you. Douglas, we've had a question specifically for you regarding the disparate group that you've got within your CDT. How can you maintain a sense of community and belonging in a virtual environment, given that they are from different countries and slightly different research disciplines?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that is indeed a challenge. I mean, part of my response is that we had the students on campus for over a year before this happened, and that, they all identify very strongly with being part of the Global Challenge cohort, Global Challenge researchers. And so in a sense, there was already a sort of an evolving sense of identity amongst the group. And, in many ways, the fact that they are now scattered across, I think, 12 different countries, plus the UK, really serves to emphasize the fact that, that global challenge research is, in fact, a global activity. So, I mean, I think that's part of the answer. But another part of the answer is really having regular opportunities. So we do have, as I say, this regular lunchtime slot on a Thursday, where it's about an hour, where all the students are welcome to engage. It's through MS Teams, and we can use the various facilities and resources that MS Teams offers. I mean, my experience of that is that you have to moderate that in a way that's slightly different from face-to-face. You have to give slightly more explicit instructions about how the meeting will run or how the presentation will go. And you have to be prepared to wait, a few seconds in silence for people to come forward with their questions. If people don't want to give questions verbally, you can encourage them to use the chat function. There's no requirement for people to turn on videos, and indeed in MS Teams, I think it only displays 4 videos maximum anyway. So in a sense, that takes a little bit off the pressure, but it's really just, if you can get to the point where what you're offering is something that students really want to engage with because it gives value to them, then I think that goes a long way towards encouraging them to keep engaging with the opportunities you have.
Thank you. So we had a question which I want to pose to Sam about detailed feedback on written work, such as long reports where one would normally scribble on the margin of a printed copy. So I guess the question is really about, can you offer any advice on how to digitally replicate that process of writing, on a candidate's work in the margins?
This isn't something I deal with on it, but I can certainly relate to this on a personal level, because personally, I much prefer scribbling on a piece of paper, and I tend to read quite a lot of papers. So personally, what I've done is I've started using an app for the iPad, which is called Good Reader. I'm not suggesting that's the best one, but basically that lets me highlight, annotate, underline, do all sorts of things to a PDF, and then I can email that version with all the comments on to somebody else if I need to. It's not ideal for me, to be honest. I'd still much rather have paper, but I'm kind of really forcing myself to work that way, and it does work, I think. But I suspect other people might have different tools that they use for a similar approach.
Thank you. And a question for James. Is there any role for external supervisors who may be local to the candidate in supporting the doctoral candidate at this time, do you think, James?
Yes, and certainly in a more normal distance supervising relationship, one of the key checks for us is what support is available to the doctoral candidate locally. In the current times, it may be that because a student might have ended up somewhere where there isn't that local support, and again, that needs to be then factored in. If they are getting an alternative type of local support arrangement, in as much as possible, try and capture that understanding without getting, there's probably not the time to be going through all the sort of formal partnering and approval processes, but make sure something is down in writing so that everyone has a shared understanding of what the local supervision is doing.
Thank you. Douglas, if I can turn to you for what's probably the last and possibly the most challenging question. It's come through on the Q&A here, so I'll just read it out. With regards to moderating expectations about progress that can be made under the conditions of the pandemic, to what extent should universities reflect this in formal adjustments to deadlines and reviews, etc.? What's your view on that?
Yeah, thank you, Owen. Yes, I mean, I think, one of the points that I made in my earlier presentation was that this is not business as usual. So I think it's very clear that, you should not be trying to drive progress or completions to a timetable that was defined before this happened. I think it's about being flexible. I think it's about making sure that the candidates understand that the normal rigidity that sometimes is perceived by candidates about university bureaucracy is much more flexible. I think it's about negotiating an individual timetable with each candidate in terms of a progress review, in terms of how it might be conducted. Normally most institutions would have some sort of formal progress review at some point, typically after about the end of the first year, and that would normally involve sort of a mini viva or oral examination by staff independent of the supervisory team. So all those things, if they're going to go ahead, would have to be negotiated and conducted through the online environment. And that you then have the challenge of getting the best out of a candidate in an online environment where they may not necessarily be familiar with using it. So, all of those things go on. And it's also worth saying that all universities pre-COVID, all universities did have various policies and procedures for things like suspension of studies, for things like considering mitigating circumstances, for things like grace period or interruption of studies or whatever it's called at your university. So, you know, we can also make use of those particular processes as well. So it may be appropriate to suspend a period of studies. You know, there are issues with things for visa validity for international students, for funding from sponsors, but, you know, all those could be folded into the consideration, you know. So I think from that point of view, there are many different processes that are available to you. And, you know, it's also partly, I think, about applying, you know, some sort of reflection and some aspect of, you know, well, what would it feel like if I were in this situation instead of the student? You know, what would I wish as a supervisor to be my experience in going through this? And that would also, I think, guide your decision-making process.
Douglas, thank you very much. And indeed, thank you to all our panelists. If you want to find out more about the Council's work to support research supervision, please do visit our Research Supervision Recognition Programme website, which you can see on the screen there, supervision.ukcge.ac.uk, where you'll find a host of free resources, including the UKCGE Good Supervisory Practice Framework and links to the latest research on doctoral pedagogy. So all that remains for me today is to thank our panelists once again. Thank you for your discussion, participants, for your willingness to pose challenging questions to our panelists. Thanks to the panelists for their willingness to openly and candidly respond to them. And I hope to see you at a future UKCGE webinar. So thank you very much.